There are times in everyone's life when it seems like they are being rejected for no apparent reason. The feeling that despite one's inner worth and potential, they are being pushed aside, as if their very presence causes discomfort to those around them. One of the most prominent psychologists in history, Carl Jung, offered an explanation for this phenomenon that may surprise you with its directness. According to Jung's theory, rejection is rarely related to specific actions or inactions of a person. The deep rejection that hurts and seems inexplicable often lies within the person themselves, in their inner strength. People are rejected not for weakness, but because the essence, authenticity, and inner strength of a person are too great to fit within the narrow confines of another's perception. This is a psychological truth that is not often spoken openly. Jung argued that every person carries a duality within them, light and shadow. Many spend their lives trying to hide their shadow, pretending to be someone else out of fear of facing their own truth. But what happens when someone with a strong presence, authenticity that doesn't require approval, and a light that doesn't hide appears in the path of such people? This person becomes a mirror, a psychological reflection. This is where the essence of Jung's theory lies. People reject those who reflect their own shadows, reminding them of what they are not. This activates unconscious envy, a sense of inferiority, and fear of not being good enough. And at that moment it is much easier to reject the mirror than to look at one's own reflection. What will happen next if you continue to look in this mirror? What secrets of the subconscious will be revealed? The answer to this question can change your perception of yourself and others forever. Deep within Jungian psychology lies one of the most significant, yet often uncomfortable lessons. The key here is understanding that the inner strength, which may be perceived as rejection, is not at all a manifestation of arrogance or inflated self-esteem. On the contrary, its roots go into a completely different soil. This strength originates in the very fact of human existence, in a deep connection with the true self, with the authentic center of the psyche, as Jung defined it. The rejection that may arise is a consequence of shedding the social mask, destroying the scenarios imposed by society, and transforming into an authentic being, a real presence, and not someone else's interpretation. Jung termed this process individuation, a path on which a person ceases to conform to the expectations of others and finds their true essence. But what happens when someone decides to be authentic in a society where conformity is so valued? Rejection, attacks, and exclusion inevitably follow. This is a kind of psychological law. The collective fears the free individual because their existence is living proof of the possibility of freedom, which in turn undermines the system based on fear and blind obedience. Paradoxically, rejection is not evidence of the wrong path, but rather an indication of the right direction. According to Jung, the emotional pain caused by rejection is the first sign of awakening and using personal psychological power. This experience can be compared to a rite of initiation, opening access to internal reserves that most people do not dare to touch. It is the experienced pain that can become a harbinger of deep psychological rebirth. However, before transforming rejection into a source of personal strength, it is necessary to understand the essence of the projection mechanism. It holds the key to avoiding the destructive effects of other people's opinions. If the topic of rejection due to personal qualities resonated with you, consider sharing your story. Perhaps someone else's story will help others realize that they are not alone in this process. In this way, everyone can contribute to collective psychological healing. In addition, support in the form of comments, likes, and subscribing to the channel helps to spread information that may be important to many people who need to understand the deep truths bequeathed by Jung. This is a real opportunity to give back to the world some of the knowledge received. If you believe that depth psychology can save lives, you can express your support. Each distribution of the video contributes to the awakening of consciousness, which is a real psychological revolution that Jung dreamed of. Have you ever felt that your presence causes dislike in others, even when you do nothing? Have you noticed that the more you remain yourself, the more often you encounter attacks or being ignored by some people? The author invites readers to share their experiences in order to explore this issue together. Together, we will delve into the psychological mechanisms underlying this phenomenon and try to understand how the projection of other people's shadows can manifest as painful rejection. It is important to realize that rejection is not always a sign of personal inadequacy, but rather may be caused by the fear you evoke in others. This thought can radically change the perception of the deepest emotional wounds. This is where Carl Jung comes in, one of the few psychologists in history who dared to tell the truth about the reasons for the rejection, exclusion, and isolation that many people face. It is generally accepted that rejection is a kind of assessment of our inadequacy, as if the world is making a final verdict on our unsuitability, lack of interest, insignificance, or unworthiness of love. However, Jung offered a completely different interpretation of this phenomenon. The psychological truth that he discovered may seem uncomfortable, but it has a liberating effect. People are rejected not for weakness, but for strength, and often for a strength that a person is not even aware of. This strength is not related to social status, material well-being, or appearance. It is rooted in mental presence, authenticity, and the ability to be yourself without needing anyone's approval. This type of influence acting at the subconscious level is rare, which is why it is perceived as a potential threat. The psychologist Carl Jung devoted a significant part of his scientific activity to the study of the hidden aspects of the psyche, those invisible factors that influence interpersonal interaction. One of these factors is psychological projection. When a person appears in a certain environment radiating genuine energy, without resorting to hypocrisy and imposed social roles, he involuntarily becomes a reflection for others who are still in captivity of their own illusions. It is important to realize that rejection is not directed at the personality as such, but at the internal conflict of another person. This is due to the discomfort caused by the manifestation of authenticity in those who have not yet dared to face the truth. Consequently, in situations where a person faces rejection in a team, being ignored by colleagues, unjustified criticism, or even sabotage by loved ones, the psychological mechanism described by Jung with amazing accuracy comes into play. In such cases, people reject not out of personal dislike, but because the presence of this person reminds them of what they themselves have suppressed. His very presence activates their shadow, that dark and hidden part of the personality that each person carries within themselves, but which most prefer to hide in order to conform to generally accepted norms. Carl Jung, an outstanding Swiss psychologist, argued that the shadow of a personality is formed from those aspects of our self that we consciously reject and suppress. These can be hidden desires, secret weaknesses, or uncomfortable truths that we do not want to admit in ourselves. When a person appears in sight, radiating inner confidence and truth, not needing approval from the outside, this provokes the awakening of the suppressed shadow in others. That is why rejection hurts so much, because it seems unfair. A person has not committed anything reprehensible, but his presence involuntarily exposes what another person does not want to see in himself. Unfortunately, most people do not have enough maturity and self-awareness to cope with this mirror reflection. Instead of looking inside themselves and facing their fears and complexes, they prefer to destroy the reflection, that is, reject or slander the person who creates this reflection. It is much easier to declare such a person an enemy than to admit one's own shortcomings and fears. This mechanism explains why authentic, self-sufficient people often become objects of gossip, being ignored and even outright attacks, disguised as well-intentioned advice. Jung argued that the process of individuation, that is, becoming oneself, is a kind of insult to the collective. The group, as a rule, does not support those who think independently, since such people cause fear and discomfort. The group is afraid of those who do not need its approval and permission. In this context lies an important psychological truth. If a person is rejected, this may be the first sign that he has finally begun to show his true inner strength. This strength has nothing to do with arrogance or a sense of superiority. It is about the power of presence, about the ability to be whole and authentic, not trading one's essence in exchange for the recognition of others. It is this presence that becomes a threat to those who still live on autopilot, playing social roles and wearing masks to please others. In reality, only a few are ready to accept this deep truth. Often people are bothered not so much by a person's behavior, words or actions, but by what their presence reveals in their own souls. This discovery, belonging to Carl Jung's analytical psychology, eludes most people because acknowledging it can be painful. When someone shines, they illuminate not only their own virtues, but also the emotional emptiness, hidden fears, and suppressed aspirations of those around them. This is not just a poetic metaphor, but a harsh reality supported by depth psychology. Carl Jung argued that every individual carries a shadow, a dark area of the psyche where unacceptable character traits are buried, qualities that have been considered wrong, shameful, or inadequate since childhood. Family and society teach us to hide these aspects of personality. However, the shadow does not disappear from suppression. It continues to exist, manifesting in reactions, suppressed emotions, and judgments projected onto others. This is where the role of a person with inner strength and the courage to be themselves, without submitting to others' expectations, becomes apparent. Such a person becomes a detonator, a living mirror, causing discomfort to those who have not dared to look into their dark side. They become a reflection of the potential that others have failed to realize in themselves. At this moment, a defense mechanism brilliantly described by Carl Jung, known as projection, comes into play. This unconscious maneuver becomes a lifeline for the mind, which is not ready to face its own demons. Instead, it seeks a reflection of its unsightly features in others. Projection manifests in the fact that an individual, unwilling to admit their own fears, envy, or feelings of inferiority, transfers these burdensome experiences to others. Instead of self-analysis and self-improvement, such people label others as arrogant, self-confident, strange, or too much. It is easier for them to create an image of an enemy than to admit that their own inner darkness is exposed in the light of another's individuality. Jung warned that the brighter a person shines with their authenticity and presence, the more they become an uncomfortable mirror for those who hide behind masks imposed by society. The unconscious nature of this mechanism is particularly dangerous. People who reject, criticize, or try to silence others often do not realize the true motives of their behavior. They sincerely believe that there are valid reasons for dislike, not realizing that they have fallen victim to projection, transferring to another person everything they are desperately trying to hide within themselves. That is why people who radiate light and confidence are often perceived by others as a threat. The rejection they face is rarely related to their personal qualities, but rather reflects the deep subconscious conflicts of those who express this rejection. Carl Jung, a prominent Swiss psychologist, argued that the unrecognized aspects of our psyche, the so-called shadow, are inevitably projected by us onto the external world. And who becomes the main target for these projections? First and foremost, those who have the courage to explore their inner world, who have dared to look their dark sides in the face instead of running away from them. By integrating these shadows, they gain integrity and become truly strong personalities. This inner strength, born from self-knowledge and acceptance, causes discomfort to many because it does not need external approval or applause. It stems from meeting oneself, the authentic self, without masks and pretense. Jung's depth psychology convincingly proves that it is this kind of strength that provokes the most acute reaction from those who are mired in half measures, hiding behind social conventions and illusions. Therefore, every time a person decides to be sincere and authentic, when they dare to take their place in the world without asking for permission, they involuntarily become an enemy to those whose psyche is wounded and who have not found the courage to do the same. They become a living reproach, a reminder of what others have given up. And in this context, rejection from certain people becomes a kind of confirmation of the correctness of the chosen path, After all, as Carl Jung himself argued, the process of individuation, that is, the path to gaining integrity and selfhood, is a revolutionary act challenging the norm, that painful state of normality in which the majority resides. A person radiating light creates discomfort because they are living proof that inner freedom is possible, and this destroys the entire mental construct of those who are convinced that to be accepted, it is necessary to conform, demean oneself, and diminish oneself. Awareness of the projection mechanism allows a person to look differently at situations of rejection. Unreasonable criticism, ignoring, or attempts at marginalization are no longer perceived as a personal defeat. On the contrary, they testify to the effectiveness of the inner light. A person becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting the surrounding reality, and is not responsible for the image that appears in the reflection. As a symbolic act, you are invited to leave a comment with the word shadow, which will mean a willingness to explore the hidden aspects of rejection and understand the true inner strength that Jung spoke of. You are also invited to share your personal experience of encountering inexplicable rejection, when a person's mere presence causes discomfort to others. These stories can become part of a collective healing process, helping others realize that they are not alone in their experiences. In the future, we plan to delve deeper into the concept of strength from the perspective of Carl Jung's analytical psychology. We will consider how true strength differs from the generally accepted notions of success and power imposed by society. In this article, we intend to lift the veil from one of the most common misconceptions concerning rejection and personal strength. Understanding the mechanisms of shadow projection and how the light of personality reveals the hidden aspects of other people makes it possible to realize that the rejection experienced is often not a consequence of one's own shortcomings. This realization plays a key role in freeing oneself from the burden of past grievances because for years many have believed that they should be less bright, less sincere, less open, less themselves. Perhaps you have heard that rejection is a signal that something is wrong with your personality, that you seem strange, lack charisma, are difficult to understand, and repel others with your arrogance. However, there is an undeniable psychological truth bequeathed by Jung that destroys this myth at its foundation. True strength, which instantly causes rejection, has nothing to do with a sense of superiority, a desire to attract attention, or a desire to prove anything. True strength, according to analytical psychology, lies in presence. Presence is a concept that Jung used with particular depth, implying the complete and conscious occupation of one's place in the world. Presence means being fully involved in the present moment, not splitting one's energy between true feelings and what is shown to others, between who one really is and who one wants to appear to be, between one's own truth and the expectations of others. Presence implies refusing to diminish one's essence in order to conform to narrow frameworks. The most difficult aspect of personal growth is that people often dislike those who possess inner integrity. These self-assured people do not seek constant approval, do not resort to manipulation for recognition, and do not change themselves to please others. Those who continue to hide behind a social mask, sacrificing their authenticity for fleeting approval, deeply, sometimes unconsciously, resent those who have dared to free themselves from this dependence. When a person appears in society, remaining true to themselves, not hiding their true feelings and beliefs, they involuntarily cause discomfort to those who are still afraid of being rejected. This is because they demonstrate an alternative way of life, where a person is not a hostage to the opinions of others. For those who have built their identity on the desire to please, this becomes an unbearable revelation. Carl Jung argued that the most important task of the human psyche is to find its true self. This complex and often painful path of individuation requires, first of all, the rejection of the social mask created for the sake of universal approval. There comes a moment when a person stops pretending, adapting to the expectations of others, and playing a role that guarantees applause, but at the cost of losing their own soul. Most people do not dare to take this step, preferring to remain captive to the image they have created, even if it stifles their true essence. This image at least guarantees them the illusion of belonging to society. However, when a person appears before the world whole, without embellishment, without fear and apologies for their uniqueness, they demonstrate that this very belonging is just a mirage. They prove that it is possible to exist outside the framework of collective approval. That is why authenticity is perceived as a challenge, as an insult, because it calls into question the established beliefs of the majority. True strength lies not in dominating others, not in a sense of superiority or imposing one's truth. To be strong means to be whole, and wholeness, according to Jung, is the greatest threat to a society mired in conformism. A whole person is free, and a free person cannot be controlled. That is why the presence of an authentic person causes discomfort to others. It exposes the price they pay for remaining in their psychological prison. Each time they betray themselves for the sake of universal recognition, they bury a part of their soul, and the presence of an integrated personality becomes a constant reminder of these inner burials. Therefore, when doubts about one's own abilities torment, when the temptation arises to change oneself for the approval of others, when a person tries to mute their individuality, they not only harm themselves, but also commit betrayal against their soul. Carl Jung called this phenomenon soul loss, a moment when a person ceases to exist as an independent unit and turns into a puppet of social norms. It is this loss of authenticity that explains why the presence of those who have retained their individuality causes discomfort in those who live in a state of fragmentation. The rejection that a person faces for their authenticity, truthfulness, emotional richness, and uniqueness is a reflection of a psychological truth. It is not the person themselves who is rejected, but that very collective mask that prevents them from fitting into generally accepted frameworks. Integrity is contagious, authenticity is perceived as a threat, and one's very existence becomes living proof that beyond the social theatre there is a real life. True strength lies not in controlling others, but in freedom from the control of others. Before continuing this fascinating psychological study, I suggest leaving your response, expressing it in one word: presence. This is not just a word, but a manifesto of willingness to be oneself without regard for the opinions of others, without the need for permission for self-expression, without hiding one's true essence, so as not to embarrass those who have chosen to remain in the shadows. Remember, have you ever had to give up yourself to earn recognition? What feelings did you experience going through this? Perhaps your story will become the spark that helps others realize that you don't need to hide behind a mask for love. Prepare yourselves, for the next stage of our journey will reveal why society is sometimes so harsh on those who dare to be themselves. We will learn how Carl Jung came to the conclusion that the greatest danger to the system is a person free from the need for belonging. It was this that prompted Jung to broaden the horizons of his research, going beyond individual psychology and delving into the collective unconscious. After all, behind the rejection that authentic people face lies something more than just personal dislike, an invisible force that maintains social order. Since the dawn of civilization, human society has invariably been built on the principle of group belonging. In those distant times when people united in tribes, acceptance into the group was tantamount to survival, while expulsion meant loss of protection, access to food, and ultimately called into question one's very existence. This ancient fear of being rejected is deeply rooted in the collective unconscious, that vast area of the human psyche that Carl Jung explored. He argued that this dimension connects all minds together like cells of a single organism. However, in this interconnectedness, there is also a cruel side. In order to be accepted by the tribe, it is necessary to conform to its norms. Members of the group must observe unspoken rules, share generally accepted beliefs, hide their differences, and suppress individuality in order not to disturb the harmony of the collective. That is why Jung argued that individuation, the process of becoming oneself, is a kind of crime against the collective. After all, the path of individuation, the psychological journey to full self-realization, involves a break with the dynamics of the masses. An authentic person, having access to their true self and not obeying the invisible rules of blind belonging, represents an existential threat to the group. The very presence of a person who thinks independently, feels independently, and acts in accordance with their truth calls into question the illusion that everyone must be the same for peaceful coexistence. This is the fundamental reason why society ostracizes those who dare to break out of established boundaries. It is not only that the individual differs from the general mass, but that their very existence serves as living proof of the possibility of freedom, which is an unbearable burden for the collective structure, whose cornerstone is control. As Carl Jung keenly observed, the collective mind is like the psyche of a child, entirely absorbed in primitive fears and a desperate need to cling to absolute truths. The collective cannot bear the chaos of individual freedom. It vitally needs order, predictability, and unquestioning obedience. And every time someone dares to be themselves, they involuntarily disrupt this fragile order. They become a cog that doesn't fit in a mechanism that only functions perfectly when all elements rotate in unison. This is precisely why society perceives authenticity as a kind of moral deviation. From the earliest childhood, individuals are taught obedience, adaptation, the desire to please, and the preservation of predictability. And when they dare to violate this unspoken pact, punishment inevitably follows. However, this punishment rarely takes obvious forms, as society has a vested interest in maintaining the illusion of its virtue, justice, and hospitality. Punitive measures manifest in a variety of ways, from patronizing instructions and caustic ridicule to veiled alienation, judgmental glances, and fragmented conversations. Often, intrigues are woven and gossip is spread behind their backs, and invitations to significant events are bypassed, doors close without explanation. In most cases, people tend to blame themselves, not realizing the true reasons behind what is happening. They feel they lack charm, sociability, or attractiveness, but in reality, they lack submissiveness. Their crime lies in the audacity to exist outside the framework of the collective mask, in the courage to think independently, in shining without regard to the opinions of others, which is unbearable for the collective mind. As Jung stated, thinking is the prerogative of the individual, not the group. The group only reacts, attacks, and defends itself from anyone who questions the inviolability of conformity. Consequently, the brighter the individuality manifests, the stronger it is perceived as a threat, and this threat is irrational in nature because the collective unconscious operates not with logic but with symbols and primitive emotions. For the collective unconscious, an authentic individual is a traitor, a stranger, capable of disrupting the fragile balance of the system. The most alarming thing in this situation is that any attempts to explain one's position, to prove good intentions, or to convince of the legitimacy of the chosen path only intensify rejection. The problem lies not in the individual's actions, but in who they are. They are living proof of the existence of a world beyond the mass prison, which is unbearable for those who need this prison to feel safe. Carl Jung, an outstanding researcher of the human psyche, argued that in the depths of the collective unconscious lies a primal fear, the fear of the destruction of the established order. This order, according to Jung, is based on a universal belief in some kind of illusion, in a kind of collective lie. Anyone who dares to question this lie, who points to an alternative path, to the possibility of gaining freedom beyond imposed masks, who declares the possibility of love without self-sacrifice and belonging without loss of individuality, will immediately be branded as a psychological heretic. And society, like the Inquisition of past centuries, will pounce on this heretic with its entire arsenal: alienation, silence, ridicule, and complete rejection. The saddest thing is that this destructive dynamic manifests not only in large-scale power structures, but also in the closest, most intimate relationships. After all, every social circle, whether it be family, friends, or a work collective, is a miniature model of society as a whole. In each of these micro-societies there is an unspoken order that protects the collective from the infection of authenticity. If there has ever been a feeling that despite all efforts there is an invisible barrier between you and the people around you, know that this is not a figment of the imagination. This is a barrier erected by the collective unconscious, protecting the group from contamination by freedom. Your freedom, your authenticity, is a spark of chaos in a system that desperately needs total control to maintain its existence. Jung believed that the only path to the healing of society lies through the liberation of the individual. A healthy collective, in his opinion, consists of free and whole individuals. However, individual freedom will always pose a threat to the herd because it clearly demonstrates the existence of an alternative path, the possibility of living outside the framework of imposed restrictions. Herein lies the real problem. Society demands conformity, the need to fit into a given framework, to obey collective opinion. However, true greatness and true freedom arise only beyond these restrictions. Those who have the courage to live according to their truth inevitably face opposition because their very existence disrupts the fragile balance of society. But it is this tension that becomes the driving force for change. Each person who has freed themselves from the shackles of collective influence involuntarily gives others an impetus to awaken, to find themselves, and to live an authentic life. Therefore, rejecting conventional norms is not a sign of defeat, but evidence of the beginning of liberation from the invisible cage of conformism. It is the price of genuine self-realization, of the individuation process that Carl Jung considered the ultimate goal of the human psyche. Ultimately, only one important question remains. Will a person continue to diminish themselves, conforming to the expectations of others out of fear of being rejected, or will they realize that rejection is confirmation that they have finally embarked on their own path?